Right, in this video, we're going to continue where the last video stopped basically, and we're going to work on that same project that we started. So you can just open up that project again, and we will continue where we left off. So what we need to change now in this application is to implement your async task instead of running everything in the main thread. So you will remember a few videos back, we created a template for the async task where we used the async task callback. So what I want you to do is to go to this site, bit.ly async task template. You will get to this document, this template async task docx, and you can download this document. And if this document is downloaded, we're going to copy a few lines of coding from here. So you can see there's the template for the async task, and there's the template for the callback, which is the interface. And we're going to create these and copy and paste so that we can reuse them. Okay, so you can go back. Your Word document looks something like this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with this interface. So I'm going to copy the interface, just copy it, go back to where we left off earlier in the previous video. So I'm going to remove this line totally so that we don't have that line. And then this build can basically sit at the end there. So in your connections.java file, just change that one. So I'm going to leave this main activity as the one which we had previously in the previous video. I'm going to leave it exactly as it is. And I'll rather create another activity so you can keep this one to see how it worked and how we changed it. So I'm going to go into my project folder again, into Java, and then the package, right click on it and say new package. Now for this package, I'm going to call this repositories and say okay. Now in here is where we're going to use these async task classes now. So we know that everything about the Room API is in these 4 classes, and then we know everything about the repositories on how we're going to call those is inside of this folder or package. Let's right click there and say new Java class, and we're going to use this now as that interface, and let's call this async task callback, and let's say okay. Now I'm going to replace this one now with that I copied, and I'm going to paste it, and you'll see it says public interface async task callback. So where did I get that again? It's from that Word document. I copied this part at the bottom and I pasted it now, and you can see that it's okay with this. It's got the same name, everything's fine. Now instead of using it as this, we're going to use a generic here. So I'm going to pass in t there, and I'm going to use this string there also as the same object type that I indicate there, and we'll see how we implement this now. So my interface will be async task callback. I can use any type of object to be returned in handle response. Now let's create, or quickly go back to the Word document, and I'm going to copy this class, public class, run something in the background, all of its brackets until the end. Just don't include the async task callback. Now let's go back and we create now a new class. So again, a new Java class. Now I'm going to call this one insert contact async, and we're going to say okay. So it's going to be called insert contact async. Now I'm going to replace this with what we copied, and instead of saying run something in the background there, we will need to create this as insert contact async. So you can see it's all in one class. I'm going to copy that one. Let's change the constructor also to the same. Let's add some import statements. Alt enter there for the import, Alt enter for your async task, Alt enter, and then we should not have any errors here. So we just copied and pasted, and we should not have any errors after importing all the important clauses. Right, so what I want to add to this one now is to not return a string back, but maybe return back the contact that we actually, let me just see contact there. So return back the contact that we actually will pass into this insert contact async. So we want to insert a new contact now to the database. That was the first thing we did in the main activity. You remember this is the first part where we tried to create a new contact, and then we need to call this line now in an async task. So we want to insert a new contact. So now what we're going to do is we're going to return back that contact if you want to do something with it later on. So for the constructor then, Now before we go into the constructor there, let's just add another variable here, private contact and contact, and we're going to use it now. You see where I'm going to use this. It's basically getting hold of the contact that will be passed into this constructor. So instead of just having a context and the callback here, I'm going to accept a contact object, and this will be the contact that I want to insert into my database. So I'm going to set this contact then to the contact that was passed in, so we can get a hold of it and use it anywhere now in this class. So you'll see, because we said this is the return type, we need to change the return type there to contact, and you'll also remember that the return type there must be changed. It can't be string anymore, so we're going to say contact as well. Now, the result that we're returning here is currently a string, and it must be a contact, so we'll fix that now. The last thing that we want to do here also is, you can see that your AsyncTask callback needs a specific type there because it's now a generic. So let's go into our AsyncTask callback here and make the type there contact, which means that in our handle response, we will also pass back a contact object. So let's just quickly have a look at that one. Inside of this AsyncTask callback, also make sure it is contact. Right, now inside of this constructor, we will accept the contact, the context, and the callback, and we set all of them. Now for these async tasks that we're going to use today, or in this video, I'm not going to use the onPreExecute method, so we can just delete them. Now let's see what we need to do in the background here, because in the main activity we said, well, we need a contact DAO, and there we get the contact DAO. Now all of this, because it's got a context, we need to do this inside of my async task. So this whole line must be inside my async task, and then I can call insert. So let's just go to the insert async task quickly. And what I want to do here, let's just remove this one line there. We can keep the exception. We remove that line, and we'll keep that exception also. So I'm going to create a new contact here. I'm going to say contact equals, and now I'm going to refer to my connections class again. So remember, under connections, if I call get instance, I get an instance of this class, and on the instance I can call get database, which returns the database. And then on that get database, I can go and call get contact DAO, which gets me the contact DAO, and after that I can call any one of the methods listed in here. So let's just go through this one step by step. I'm going to go to the connections class. I'm going to call get instance. That gets me an instance of the connections class. On that instance, I can call get database, which gets me a connection to the app database. On app database, I can call get contact DAO, which gets me an instance of the contact DAO. And on that, I can use the methods. So I'm going to say the new contact, or the contact that we want to insert to the database, I need to first find out if that contact exists. So I'm going to call the get contact by its ID. Now, do I know this contact that we want to insert? So this is the contact that we want to insert. It's called contact there. We set it to our contact at the top. So we know, in this case, the constructor for the get instance method in connections, or what we pass into the method, is the context there. So what I need to have here is the context. And again, refer to, well, we can't say get application context, so we've got a context passed in. So we can actually just refer to that context. .get database, .get contact here. Let me just go to a new line after this, and we're going to get the contact by its ID. Now, what is the ID of this contact? Well, the contact that we want to insert is already there. So we've got the contact by referring to this .contact. And that is the contact that was passed in, and also the contact that we want to insert. But we first want to find out if this contact doesn't already exist. So then I'm going to call get ID on that, and that gets me the ID. It will go into the database, get the contact by ID, and save it into contact. So if that contact exists, then this will link to an object. Otherwise it won't, which means I can again go and test if contact is equal to null. Then we know we can insert this object now into the database, because there's no contact that exists in the database with that specific ID. So we're going to go to connections again, call get instance again. we can pass in the context again, get the database again, get the contact DAO again, and then we can now insert this new contact. And I'm just going to call this dot contact. Now we know that contact doesn't exist in the database, but we can pass it now into the database using the insert method. Right, so that will insert this new contact object into the database. Now, what is the else part? The else part is this contact doesn't exist. So what we can do here, or this contact exists, and what we can do then is to force a new exception to occur. Because we're catching the exception there, we can add our own exception message here. So I'm going to say throw new exception, and let's just add a message there for this exception, and we can say something like contact already exists. So if this contact is not equal to null, it means the contact already exists, the one that you're trying to insert into the database. And then we force this exception to occur with this message. So if I call on the exception object, if I call e.getMessage, then it will get the message of contact already exists. Right, and then we catch that exception. And then after that, we can actually go and return the contact now. So I'm going to say this dot contact. So now it is returning a contact object, which is 100% fine. Now, which contact object will it return? Basically the same one that you just passed in. So you pass in this one, the contact that you want to insert into the database, into the constructor. It will go into the do in background, add it. If it does not exist, it will add it to your database and then return that very same contact, so that in the main activity you can go and say, well, this contact with this ID or whatever has been successfully inserted. So you got a link to that one back again. Right, so then it will be passed through. We will test if the callback is not equal to null. If the exception is null, which means there was no exception, we call the handle response method and we will pass through S, which is the contact. Otherwise, if there was an exception, we will call handle fault. Right, so this is inserting a new contact to the database. Now, before I carry on with the next methods, let's just go and see how we can create another activity here to run this in. So I'm going to say new activity, empty activity. And let's just call this one main2 activity. That's fine. And say finish. Right, so you'll see you've got a brand new activity. Now, instead of pointing it to activity underscore main2, let's make it one again, the normal one, which means it's also going to load this activity main XML and not this one. So we can actually delete this one. Let's just delete that one and we keep the same layout for both activities. Right, and then if we go to our manifest file now, you will see that we've got two activities. There's our activity, main2 activity, and then the normal main activity. So I'm going to copy this whole intent filter there for the normal main activity. And you can paste it there. Or the other option is to make this one main2 activity and make that one just main activity, which means that main2 activity will be the one that launches. Right, so now main2 activity is the main one and the one that will launch. So let's just close down this. So it should work now. And now what we did here in our main activities, if you quickly go there, I'm just going to copy and paste all of these again. Those, just go to main2 activity. I'm going to paste those there. 100%. Go back to the main activity again. This is all the links to it to make sure that we link up to all the components on that layout file. 100%. And then we can go and copy and paste all of these buttons. And then we will just remove that. Just get them all. Go to the main2 activity and paste them there. Right, so what we're going to do now is I'm going to delete this part totally. You can just see, yeah, I think we'll redo all of this. So let's just delete them so that we get empty methods there. For this contact that needs to be passed in, we can just keep that one as it is. So this is then main2 activity. It's got all the links from the normal activity already there with all the buttons set up. Okay, so this is main2 activity. So for main2 activity, we're going to leave this contact there in the btn create button. So we can create or get that contact, create the contact, all the data from the user, and now we can call this insert contact async. So how do we call it? So we're going to say new insert contact async. So now if you look at your contact async, we need to pass in a contact, a context, and a callback. So let's start with the contact. So there's the contact that we're going to pass in. Second one, the context. So make sure it's get application context. And the third one is your new AsyncTask callback. And you can see the type there for the generic is contact, which means it's going to work nicely for us here. And then have your semicolon at the end. Just remember to also call your execute method. Now we've got our insert contact async, passing in the contact that we want to insert, passing in the context and the AsyncTask callback, so that the handle response and the handle fault can be run. Right, so in the handle response, if everything went fine, then this object there now will be the contact that we actually passed in. It will be that same one that got back, and now it's successfully done. So we can show it toast, saying something like, let's go refer that to that object. So we're going to say object dot get name, for example, plus, and then we can add some information there. Let's say successfully added to the database. Right. And then in the handle fault, we can show a toast with a message error and e.getMessage. Right, and this is basically how we will insert a new contact. So we created the contact, pass in the contact to this new AsyncTask class, the insert contact async. It will go take that contact that you passed in, save it to our contact, go into the do in background method, get a link, or just check if that ID actually exists in the database. So get the contact by its ID, and if it does exist, something will be linked to contact. If it doesn't exist, it will be null. So if it is null, then we can insert that one to the database, because it means it doesn't yet exist. The else will be if it does exist in the database, we will force an exception to occur, and if that exception occurred, we'll go into the exception there. And this is why we test. If exception is null, then, and it means no exception occurred, so we call handle response. But if an exception occurred, there will be something linked to exception, and we will call handle fault with the exception. Right, so if you look at the main to activity again, in handle response, it means everything went fine, and that object we can call get name, get ID, or get cell, and maybe say some other information with that. If the fault occurs, we're going to call e.getMessage and show the message to the user. Right, so we'll test this now after we've done the read part also. So let's go into repositories again, and we're going to reuse this AsyncTask callback because it's taking in a generic, so we can basically pass in anything through the handle response method. So I'm just going to keep it as it is. So let's create our next AsyncTask class, which we will call getAllContactsAsync. So let's just go and say new Java class in there, and we're going to call this one getAllContactsAsync. Say OK. Now let's go back to that Word document again, and we copy this whole thing again. So I'm just going to copy, paste it, same as we did with the previous one. I'm going to change this, run something in the background to get all contacts async. Right, copy that one again, paste it for the constructor, AsyncTask, Alt Enter, context, Alt Enter. You should not have any problems. Okay, so now we need to get all the contacts. So if you go to main activity, you remember how we did this. We said under read there, we need to get this contact DAO.getAllContacts, and that gets saved into a list, and then we use the string builder. Right, so let's go to getAllContactsAsync. So what we want to do here is to keep the context. For the callback again, let's pass back a contact again. Well, in this case, not just one contact, but a list of contacts. Right, so now Alt Enter on that one and Alt Enter on your list. And then we can pass in a list of contacts, and then this is also what we need to return here. So it's going to be list contact, That's what we'll be returning there, and also what we'll be accepting there. So it's a list of contact objects. Right, so obviously our results there will give us a problem, so let's just remove it and we'll get back to it later. Now what I want to get back in my AsyncTask callback inside of this handle response will also now be a list of contact objects. So let's maybe change this one to response instead of just object there. So if we go back to our insert contacts async, everything should be fine here. If we go back to the main activity, actually when we call this object should be response. So it's a bit better than just object. And let's use that one also as response. Right, that looks a bit better. Let's go back to get all contacts async. So what we want to do here is to change this AsyncTask callback now to accepting a list of contact objects. So the type, the generic type for this async callback will be list contact. And it's exactly what we want to use here as well, list contact. And then we know our callback is done. Right, so we're going to have the context, we're going to have the callback. We will not use the on pre-execute, this is fine. And then inside of the do in background, what do we need to do here? So we're going to return back a list of contacts. So again, in order to get that list of contacts, I'm going to set that list at the top. So I'm going to say list contact. Let's call this contacts. And we set it to null right at the start. Now in the try block, we want to get that contacts now. So we're going to say contacts equals. Again, I'm going to refer to my connections class. On the connections class, there's a get instance that gets you an instance of the class. It needs the context, but luckily we have a context that was passed in. So I'm just going to say this dot context. Then on the get instance method, I can get the database or a link to the database. And on that, I can get the contact DAO, which takes me to my contact DAO class, this one with all the methods to insert, delete, update, whatever. And what I want to call now is the method that says get all contacts. And you can see it automatically picks it up also. And that get all contacts method will get me all the contacts that's currently in the database as a list. So you'll remember, if we open up this one quickly, you can see that get all contacts retrieve back for me a list of contact objects. And that's exactly what we want here. Now what we can just do here is to also make sure that contacts actually has something to it. So we're going to say if this contacts.size is equal to 0, then we know that there's nothing, absolutely nothing in that database yet. And we can throw or force a new exception to occur. And let's just put our own message in there, and it will be something like no data found in the database. So if we make a connection to the database and we try to get all the contact objects, but there's nothing yet in the database, it will just force this exception to occur, and it will say no data found in the database. But if the exception does not occur, we want to retrieve or return back that list of contacts. So where's that list? We call it contacts. So that's exactly the one that we want to return back. Now, where does it return back to? It will return back to this S. And then if the exception is null, which means no exception occurred, we'll pass that S, which is a list of all the contacts, to the handle response method. Otherwise, we will return back that exception. So let's go to main2 activity and see how we can implement the read part. Now let's just call that AsyncTask quickly. So we're going to say get all contacts async. Now again, we need the context. So remember, get application context. Second argument is the callback. So we're just going to say new, start typing A, and you can see automatically it picks up that list of contacts that we'll get back. Right, and then just remember your execute method there and your semicolon at the end. Right, so by just calling this, if nothing went wrong, then this response will be my list of contact objects. And now you remember in my main activity, we took that list and we used the string builder to create a new string. So I'm going to copy this part and let's go back to main2 activity. And that's what I want to do in handle response. I want to create a new string builder with the results, going for I equals 0, I less than contacts is now this response there. So let's just replace that one with response, this one with response, this one with response, and this one with response. So now in the handle response method, I've got a link to all of my contacts in the database as a list, and I can use this as a normal array list and build my result. Now, because we are in the user interface again, I do have direct access to TV results. So I can just go and set the text on TV results as results.toString. So almost the same as we did here. We went to TV results.setText and results.toString. Now exactly the same thing, but it's inside of my AsyncTask call. Now in the handle fault part, we can just show that exception message again. So we can say error plus e.getMessage. Right, and that is the read part inside of an async task. So I think at this stage, let's try and run this application. Right, and there we are back at the application. So if I click on read now, it will remember the previous data we had in the database. So if you want to remove that from your app, you can go into the settings. So let's just go to settings quickly. Go to settings. Let's go down to apps and search for your app called Room API. So there it is. Go into the app. Go into storage, and what I'm going to do is to say clear data and say okay, and that will remove my SQLite database for this app. So if I go back and I run this again, well, I can actually just run the app. There it is, and I call a read now. You can see it says error, no data found in the database. So where's that running now? So if I click on read, no data found in the database. So it's in my get all contacts async where it could not find any data in the database. So it says no data found in the database. It's that exception that occurred, and that's why we won't get anything in the results. All right, so let's start anew with this one. So I'm going to use a 1001. Let's add a telephone number there, and let's say Chuck Norris again, and we can say create. Chuck Norris successfully added to the database. Click on read, Chuck Norris is in the database. Let's add another one. 2. John Rambo. Create, successfully added to the database. Click on read, John Rambo is there. If I click on create again, it will say contact already exists. So if I click on create, it throws an exception. So now it's insert contact. It's throwing this exception because that contact already exists in the database. Right, so that's the first two methods. So let's look at the last two. I'm going to close down these. Maybe contact as well, contact DAO, app database connections. So we'll keep open the main activity and main2 activity, and that's all we can keep open. Right, so now the next part, we've got btn create, we've got btn read. So let's see how we can update something on the database. Right, so in order to do the update and the delete part, we'll need a method to check for a specific contact. So what I'm going to do inside of this repository is create a new one. So let's go to the Word document, get that whole file again, and then under repositories, I'm going to say new Java class again, and this class I will call find contact by ID, and let's add async at the end. Find contact by ID async. Right, and then I'm going to replace this with our template, and let's rename this quickly again. Find contact by ID async. Copy that again, and let's change it for the constructor. Alt enter over the async task, Alt enter over context, and there should not be any errors. This async task will help me to get a specific ID or a specific contact by its ID. So what we initially want to basically send back here is that contact that we found. So I'm going to use contact there as the one that we're going to get back. It's only one contact in this case. So also here should be contact, and also where we get it back in the on post execute should be contact. Right, so we're going to find a contact by its ID and then return that contact. So let's just create a variable here for the ID. So I'm going to have long ID there, and then we're also going to pass in an ID to this constructor. So we're going to have a long ID there so that we can search for this ID in the database. And then I'm going to say this.id equals the ID that was passed in. Right, so what should the AsyncTask callbacks type be this time? It will be a contact. So make sure that you also set the type there, contact. Right, so again, the on pre-execute we will not use at all. And now let's have a look at our do in background method again. So I'm going to remove that line, I'm going to remove this line, and then we'll see how we do the rest. Right, so at the start, I'm going to start with a contact there, and I'm going to set the contact to null, because ultimately that's what we want to return back here. So I'm going to set it null there so that if it throws an exception that I can still return it here. Okay, so even if it's returning a null, because we're not really using that, we will use handle fault. Okay, so I'm setting up the contact is equal to null. In the try block now, I need to find a contact by its ID. And you remember that we have a method that says get contact by ID. So we will just basically call this method that will run the query to get a contact by its ID. Right, so we're going to say contact equals going to our connections class, calling get instance. It needs a context. Luckily we have a context, so we're just going to say this dot context. On that we call get database, which gets me the database. On that we call get contact DAO, which gets me this access to these methods. And now I can just call the method. So the method I want is get contact by ID. Right, so what is the ID? Do we have the ID? Yes, it's this dot ID. I'm just going to go to a new line here. So you agree that get contact by ID will get the contact for the ID that we passed in. Now we have that contact, and we can just test there if this contact is equal to null. Then we'll just force an exception again to occur, and we're going to have contact does not exist. And then if this exception occurs, the exception will be caught and we will call handle fault. If there's no exception, we will return back this contact that we found now into handle response. And that's it for this find contact by ID async. So in the main to activity, we will first call find the contact by its ID. And then if it's found, we can actually go and update that contact. So let's go to creating another class here. So let's just go to the Word document again, copy that, and let's add the one to update. So you're going to right click, say new Java class again, and let's call this one update contact async. Say OK, replace it totally with this one that you copied. And let's change the name back to update contact async. Just going to copy that one, paste it there, Alt Enter for your import, Alt Enter for your import, and should not have any other errors. Right, so now we've got the find contact by ID, and we're going to use that now in the main activity or the main to activity. But now we first need to create this update contact async. So what are we going to do here? We're going to pass in a contact, and we want to update that contact. So we'll need the context, the callback, and the exception. And we're going to have an extra one here that says contact. Alt Enter for your import. And we'll also accept this contact to be updated. So I'm going to say contact, contact. And then my contact, this dot contact, will be set to the contact that was passed in. So we have a connection to it that we can use in the do in background method. Now again, what are we going to return back from the do in background? We want to update the contact, so maybe let's return back that contact that we just updated. So I'm going to return back a contact, which means that your do in background should return a contact, and which means that your on post execute should accept a contact there. Right, and then your async task callbacks type must then also be of type contact. Right, then let's go into, we can remove on pre-execute again. We're not going to use it. I'm going to remove this line again, that line again. Okay, so now what I want to do here is to get that contact again. But now because we're going to call find contact by ID first, we will know from that method whether the contact exists or not. So we don't need to make sure that it exists. We can just basically add this contact now into, or update this contact on the database. So I'm just going to call connections.getInstance, and now the context, luckily we've got a context here, .getDatabase.getContactDAO.update. And now we're going to update which one? Well, it's going to be this .contact. So remember, inside of find contact by async, we will throw an exception if it does not exist, and we will stop right there. We won't call update contact async. So we don't need to test inside update contact async whether that one exists or not. Right, and now the one that we can return there is now the updated one, which is this .contact. We can return back again. Just to have the same one that was passed in, we will return back as the updated one and say, well, everything went fine. Now in the on post execute, if everything went fine, we're going to call handle response, retrieving back that contact, and if there's something wrong, we will run handle fault. Now let's go to main to activity and let's see how we call this. Right, so we will start with firstly calling find the contact by its ID. So now you can see we need to pass in an ID there. So if you look at our application now, we've got two persons in this database. So let's say we're going to search for John Rambo, which is 1002. So I'm going to say 1002, and then if it gives you a problem because it needs a long year, you can just append the L there. Now look at your find contact by ID async. It accepts an ID, a context, and the callback. So the context will be get application context, and then the callback will be new async task callback. And then just remember to use .execute there. Right, so this is what happens. We find the contact by its ID, sending in 1002. What happens? It gets the ID there, goes into the background, searches for it. If it gets it, if it's null, it's going to say it doesn't exist and throw an exception. But if it's not null, it's going to handle or run handle response and everything's fine. Which means that if we get to handle response, we can now update. If we get to handle fault, we cannot update. So we'll just show the toast there with error and showing that exception message, e.getMessage. Right, so what should happen now in handle response? If handle response is executed, it means that this is the contact with this ID. That will be the contact, and then that contact we can now update. So let's make a change to that one then. So we can say response.set name or cell or whatever. So let me just see again, it's 1002, so it's John Rambo. So let's make his name Peter Rambo. Okay, so just changing the name. And now after changing it, we can now send that back to update contact async. So we're going to say new update contact async. What does it accept? A contact object, a context, and the callback. So the contact object is this response, the context, get application context, the callback, new async callback. Right, in there, .execute again. So now you can see that I'm running an async task inside of another one there, but only if this async task is done and handle response has been executed, then we will run the update part. And again, that response with Peter Rambo in it will then be passed in, and we can show a toast in here. In this handle response, we can say, let's say response.getName to see that it changed, plus successfully updated. Because it's in handle response, everything went fine. Handle fault again, if something went fault after this guy actually exists, but we couldn't update, then this could be another error. So we need to handle that one also. So let's say plus e.getMessage. Right, so this one is a bit more complex, where we first find the contact to make sure it exists, then change it, and then pass it into update. Right, let's do the last one. So the update and the delete methods basically works the same, because we also need to find that user first, or that contact first, before we can be able to delete it. So we will also need to go and create another one for the repositories. Luckily, the find contact by ID is already there, and we use it in both update and delete. Right, so let's go down to the Word document again, copy that, create a new repository there, new Java class, and let's call this one delete contact async. Say OK. Replace it. Let's give it the new name, delete contact async. Copy it, make the constructor the same, Alt Enter for the import, Alt Enter for the import, and then should not be any errors. Now basically the same thing again. Instead of updating, we're deleting now. So I'll also need an ID. So let's say a long ID there to be passed in for the one that I want to delete. Or you can use the contact object there and pass in the contact. Remember, we have two delete methods there. We've got one that accepts the ID and one that accepts a contact object. So maybe you can redo this one later on to see if you can do it with passing in a contact instead of passing in the ID. Right, so I'm going to have there a long ID that will be passed in, and then I'm going to say this.id should be the ID that was passed in. Now, what are we going to return back again? Maybe also this contact that was now deleted should be returned back, so that we can just have some sort of message to the user that makes sense. So let's import our contact class there. So we're going to return contact. We're going to return contact here as well. And in the on post execute also contact there. Right, now the AsyncTask callback also, the type will be contact, because we will return back a contact. Again, we will not use the on pre-execute method, so we can remove that one. And now let's go do the do in background method. Right, so now what I want to do here is to basically just delete this contact with the specific ID. Now, if we quickly have a look at the find contact by ID async, you will see that this method returns back the contact that it found. So we can actually just work with that contact, will probably be easier here. So let's just say here contact, and passing in, we will pass in a contact, so we get contact there as well. And then for the rest it should be fine. And let's make this also contact and that one also contact. So because our find contact by ID method returns a contact object, we can directly use that contact object then afterwards to just delete it. Okay, so we passed it in, and then inside of the try block we can just delete it. So we're going to say connections dot get instance. Again, it wants the context, so it's this dot context dot get database dot get contact DAO dot. And what we want to do now is to delete. So there's two that you can call. I'm going to call this one because the find contact by ID is returning that one. And the contact that I want to delete is the one that was passed in, this dot contact. Right, and then what do we return back? Again, it will be this dot contact. Right, and then everything should be fine. Let me just remove that import statement at the top. Right, I think this class should be fine then also. So let's go back to the main2 activity and see if we can do this one. So again, we're going to find a contact by its ID first. So the ID we need to pass in. So let's try and delete this same Peter Rambo. That should be 1002 there. It's a long ID. And then the second argument is the context. So we're going to say get application context and then say new AsyncTask callback again. Remember .execute there. And then you can see there's handle response and handle fault. So we find the contact. If the contact is there, now we can delete it. So inside of handle fault, we will say toast error plus e dot get message. Now in handle response, we want to now delete, because if it gets into handle response, we know that that contact with this ID exists. There's the contact object, and we can just delete it. So let's just call delete contact async. It accepts the contact to be deleted, the context, and the async callback. So the contact to be deleted is this response. The context is get application context, and then new async task callback. Again, .execute to make sure it executes. Right, and there we go. So in handle fault again, we can just show a toast again by saying error plus e.getMessage. And then in the handle response, this is now, we deleted this contact now successfully. So we can say toast. Now that contact will be passed back again, so we can refer to it by saying response.getName, and we can say successfully deleted. Right, I think it's time to run this application and see if all of our changes actually worked. Right, so let's click on read again. So this is that's currently in the database. So if I click on update, I'm going to go to 1002, which is John Rambo, and we're going to change John Rambo to Peter Rambo. So let's click on update. Peter Rambo successfully updated. Read. Now it's Peter Rambo. Okay, so update working 100%. Let's click on delete quickly. So what do we do in delete? Also looking at 1002, which is Peter Rambo. See if it exists and then delete it. So if I click on it, successfully deleted. Read. There's only one in the database. So if I click delete again, 1002 doesn't exist anymore. So it should give me another message. Contact does not exist. Right, so this is how we do the Room API with using the async task. Now, if you go back to your, let me just quickly go back, you can see that all my repositories is in one package there. All my Room database stuff is in another package. So if there's something wrong with the database, I can go down here and search for the problem here. Otherwise, the problem could be in one of these classes. Right, so now what we want to have a look at is this app database. And you remember that we, not the app database, connections. You remember that we actually removed that one to run it in the user interface. So you can see that it works perfectly by just calling build. So the way that we've done it now runs without any memory leaks and is 100% correct for your production APK that you want to run. Hope you've learned something from this video. See you in the next one.